Hello, good evening. I'm Father Alexander. This is St. Peter's in Hove, and welcome to our 58th step in our walking tour through the Bible. And I want to look now at chapter 8 of the book of Joshua, which deals with the capture of the town of Ai, A-I, a town that's never mentioned elsewhere, I think, in the entire Bible. Now, if you look at verse, chapter 8, the description of the taking of the town, this really does look like a historical account. In fact, the town is taken, if you like, by a stratagem. Joshua and his men, first of all, they're beaten off once, and 36 men are killed. Not a great number, which shows that in those days that the armies were very small. The armies had to be very small in those days, simply because it was beyond anybody's capability to equip, feed, and keep going a vast quantity of men. They simply didn't have the civil servants and people like that to do it. Anyway, they're defeated, first of all, which is interpreted as being because one of them has broken the rules about Jericho, the not giving everything that should have been destroyed into the treasury of the Lord or having it destroyed. Now, what they do, the trick that brings about the destruction of Ai, is exactly the same trick that is used by William the Conqueror at the Battle of Senlac Hill, more popularly called the Battle of Hastings. The children of Israel pretend to run away. The people of Ai follow them, thinking they've got them on the run, and abandon the town, essentially, whereupon some people who Joshua has left in ambush come out, set the town on fire, and then the people of Ai look around, and to their horror, they see their town is on fire. Then the people who they thought were running away turn and fight. Then the people who set fire to the town also attack them from behind, and they are annihilated. They're caught in a classical pincer movement. But if you remember, this is what happened at the Battle of Hastings. The Normans pretended to run away. The Anglo-Saxons left the hill they were defending, and then, when they were not on the hill anymore, the Normans turned around and massacred them. Now, also, so this does sound actually quite plausible, doesn't it? This does sound like a real account for battle, a historical account for battle, whereas, as I said yesterday, the fall of Jericho is a much more theological sort of story. Now, the number of those who fell that day, men and women together, was 12,000. All the people of Ai. That's verse 25. 12,000 actually sounds a reasonable figure. If that's the entire population of Ai, 12,000 would be a very small town by today's standards, a large village by today's standards. But in those days, a rather substantial town. And then Joshua did not draw back the hand with which he had pointed the saber until he had subjected all the inhabitants of Ai to the curse of destruction. So genocide then takes place. For booty, for booty, Israel took only the cattle and the spoils of this town in accordance with the order that the Lord had given to Joshua. Joshua then burned Ai, making it a ruin for evermore, a desolate place even today. That's why we don't hear about Ai again in the Bible, because it was never rebuilt. He hanged the king of Ai from a tree till evening. But at sunset, Joshua ordered his body to be taken down from the tree. It was thrown down at the entrance to the town gate, and on top of it was raised a great mound of stones, which is still there today. Now, we talked about yesterday how the Holy Land, and indeed the Middle East, is dotted with these mounds, these artificial mounds, which are piles of ruins essentially, called tells. And there is a sort of a minor form of a tell, which is what we would call in English a cairn. That's a pile of stones. You bury somebody and you raise up a huge pile of stones over them, so it acts as a landmark. And the tell of Ai is presumably taken to be, by future generations, the cairn, the burial place, marking the burial place of the king of Ai, the person who dared to stand up to the Israelites and who was defeated and was killed. The king of Ai is hanged from a tree. This is, I think, it's true to say, for me at least, the first tragic story in the Bible. What was the king of Ai to do if not defend his own town? And they took him. He survived the battle. They took him and they strung him up from a tree. What did the king of Ai say? We don't know. What did the king of Ai feel? We can imagine the desolation of that scene. And then his body is left there, but is taken down at sunset, because according to the law of Moses, the bodies should not be left overnight on a tree, on a gallows. This reminds us, obviously, of something else, doesn't it? The person whose body was not allowed to stay on the tree overnight, namely Jesus, whose body was taken down before sunset and placed in a tomb. So the king of Ai is taken down in accordance with the law, and Joshua ordered his body to be taken down from the tree. It was then thrown down at the entrance to the town gate, and on top of it was raised a great mound of stones, which is still there today. So the king, he's thrown down, and a pile of stones is put on top of him. So his resting place serves as a warning to all who would stand in the way of the God of Israel, and indeed in the way of the victorious children of Israel. And yet, I do think this is a tragic story. He hanged the king of Ai from a tree till evening, but at sunset Joshua ordered his body to be taken down. So the sun is going down, they remove the body. It is a tragic story. The king of Ai couldn't have done anything differently. The king of Ai could not have saved his life. The king of Ai is a victim of history. He's a victim in this story, in the context of this story, a victim of God. He stood in the way of God, therefore he had to go. Or at least that's how Joshua sees it. God, I'm sure, does not quite share Joshua's vision. I'm reminded very much as I read this of, it's only one line that strikes me here, I'm reminded very much of the great poem of Virgil, the Aeneid. The Aeneid is about the victorious sweep of Rome, and how Rome is destined to conquer the world, how Rome is destined to be the chosen people of God, if you like, who are going to bring peace and prosperity to the world. And yet the victims of Rome, the people who have to be removed to make space for Rome, are treated with huge sympathy, and indeed are tragic figures. One thinks of Dido and one thinks of Turnus. And here too, one thinks of the king of Ai, somebody who has to be removed so that Israel can be planted in the promised land. And so I think, one of the things we've got to realize here, sympathy for the defeated is a markedly Christian virtue. And it's also clearly a Jewish virtue, because the people who wrote this were Jewish and they had sympathy for the defeated as well. I think the sympathy does come out in that sentence. And so while it's clearly the will of God that Israel should triumph, at the same time, we must learn compassion to those who suffer and who stand in the way of what we assume to be progress. And indeed, it makes us question the triumph of Israel in the book of Joshua. What about the king of Ai? What about the king of Jericho? Because something similar had happened to him as well. Okay, so compassion, compassion, compassion. That's the lesson for tonight. All the best. Bye.